Hey, John.
Hey, George.
How you doing?
Doing pretty good. How about?
Good. How was your week?
Well, today is nice. It's been freezing here all week, but it's finally spring. Spring has sprung. Warm, must be close to 70.
Oh, that's great. It's warmer there than it is here.
Oh, good. That's nice to hear.
Yeah, when we were talking last week, there was actually a big snowstorm.
Yeah, well, and then we got this huge northeastern, I guess it was, and there's...
Oh, yeah, I read about
some of the... I guess it was the heaviest rain in history in New York City, and places in northern Jersey flooded, and...
Wow.
So, we're fine here because we're on this little rocky knoll, but anyway, that's all over. Now it's nice and sunny, and I guess it's going to be for a while.
Well, that's good. Yeah, it's still a little chilly here. We're having a global cooling kind of effect.
Global cooling.
Yeah.
Well, some places have to get colder. That's just...
Right, I think it's going to be here, so that's good.
So, I guess inevitably we have to talk about the big news story, which was breaking as we spoke last week. Yeah, the shootings at Virginia Tech.
Horrible.
Yeah, I just have to say, as a way of getting into this, I just this morning looked at the most recent blog of Bob Wright and Mickey Kaus, who I guess are the two originals for blogging heads. And Mickey, unless he's being ironic and I misunderstood him, I think he was actually proposing that the solution to this kind of violence is for there to be more people with guns.
Oh, well, that's what the National Rifle Association said, right? I mean, they always say that if everyone had been carrying a concealed weapon, that he never would have dared do this.
Right. Or, there could have been some other students in the dorm or the classrooms who were packing guns and could have blown this kid away when he came into the classroom. I've got to say, apparently...
Are you sure you really meant that?
I think he did. Either he was joking, in which case it was a very bad joke, or he's serious. And if he's serious, it's one of the most idiotic responses I can imagine to this whole tragedy. I mean...
Well, the NRA really said it, right?
Yeah, well, if this isn't... Well, you expect that of the NRA, but from this supposedly...
What did Robert Wright say?
I was surprised. I thought Bob would kill Mickey over this, but Bob was very muted in response. He sort of protested mildly and then let it drop. I mean, if I'm characterizing them unfairly, I hope they'll respond in some way. But
I hope so too.
But I was horrified. I mean, the only good that I can see coming out of an event like this is more restrictions. Is finally people and politicians get serious about gun control and realize that this right to bear arms is completely out of date at this point, and we've got to grow up past this adolescent infatuation with weaponry and control these things, and especially control them so that somebody who's obviously mentally unbalanced and had even been committed to a mental hospital can't get them.
Yeah, you'd think.
I don't know. This kind of thing really drives me crazy. I look at this event.
Yeah, it's horrible. I mean, when I was just out of college, when I had my first job, I was covering the police beat for the Albuquerque Journal, so I got to see some pretty grisly stuff firsthand. And at the same time, I had a girlfriend who. She was like late teens, and she went to Kmart and bought a gun because she felt she needed it to protect herself.
Really?
This was before I had met her.
Uh-huh.
And then she ended up getting drunk one night and blowing a hole in her stomach.
Oh my God, you're kidding! Did she?
Just the fact that
did she survive?
She could go into Walmart, or I guess they didn't have Walmart then. It must have been Kmart.
Yeah.
And buy this thing. And of course, it's a little harder now, but apparently not hard enough. But
well, I've got a friend who teaches at a school in Virginia, James Madison University, and I'm not sure if this is still the case, but I visited him about 10 years ago, and we're driving around, decide to pick up a 6-pack of beer, and we go into this store, and it sells booze and guns.
Yeah.
You know, get your ammo and pick up a fifth of Jack Daniels at the same time.
Yeah.
It's just insane. You know, I look at events like these crazy mass killings with some deranged shooter in the same way that I look at the war in Iraq. So what possible good can come of this? What I would hope would come out of this shooting is that people get serious about gun controls and that politicians get some guts on this issue, at least the politicians who are ostensibly for gun control. In the same way that I see the only good coming from the war in Iraq would be that war as a means of pursuing foreign policy is discredited. I mean, that's the only. I just hope.
But do you think that's ever going to be possible? I mean, isn't it just too ingrained in the human species?
Well, you know, actually, this is something that I've given a lot of thought to lately. And in fact, I don't know if you saw this article by Steven Pinker recently. It came out in the New Republic, and it's posted on Edge.org, this website run by John Brockman.
Okay, what did Pinker say? I mean, he's a linguist at MIT. We should remind people. And
he's a linguist at MIT, but he's gotten infected with the evolutionary psychology meme, and so
he's really become one of the public intellectuals that are kind of a real breeding ground seems to be Edge.org, and they have these great discussions.
That's right, and so Pinker is, I mean, he's sort of like Bob Wright. He's a popularizer of evolutionary psychology. So in both How the Mind Works and the Blank Slate, those are Pinker's, I think, his two most recent books. He argues...
And then the Language Instinct, which was wonderful.
Yeah, the Language Instinct was before he had become a hardcore Darwinian.
I see.
That's when he was a hardcore Chomsky, and we'll get to that later.
Hardcore Darwinian, I mean, any person with a scientific mind is a hardcore Darwinian, aren't they?
Well, the question is how much you think can be explained, how much of human nature, human behavior, and human psychology can be explained by looking at the brain as this organ that's been shaped by evolution and has these various adaptations that, again, can be explained by natural selection. So the true believers think that evolution can explain virtually everything that we do. So in this particular essay that Pinker just wrote, it's called A History of Violence. Mm-hmm. And in it he reiterates the claim that he made both in Blank Slate and How the Mind Works, that human aggression, for example, and behaviors such as interpersonal violence right on up to warfare can be understood as instincts in a way, or as behaviors that have been shaped by evolution. So to a great extent, they're in our genes. And, you know, we were talking about this last week. Of course, everything is in our genes to a certain extent. But I think that the way that Pinker and some other Darwinians have analyzed warfare in particular is really grossly simplistic.
Yeah, but it really rings true that this stuff is just so deeply ingrained in our... I mean, it's almost cellular, it seems like. You know, it goes back to survival of the fittest and, you know, establishing territories for gathering food and defending your territory. It just doesn't seem surprising to me that this would have a very deep evolutionary roots.
George, when was the last time you were in a fist fight?
It's been a couple of decades, and I was just the receiver of the of the fist. But you know, I'd be so bad at that I would never get into one. But I've certainly gotten angry enough that I had to suppress a feeling that if I could hit someone and not break my knuckles and then get hit back and kill, that I might have felt like doing it. I felt the the hormonal rush of anger, but and I was able to suppress it. But it seems pretty basic to me. I mean,
that's. I think all of us obviously have the capacity to commit violent acts in certain situations.
So where does it come from?
Okay, well, I think that you could argue that, like all our behaviors, is mediated by biology. But let me just point out something that Pinker brought up in this essay of his that I think undercuts his whole thesis that the best way to understand these behaviors is in evolutionary and biological terms. He points out that there has been, and quite rightly, because I know this literature too, that there has been this really dramatic decline in violence over the past few centuries, and also in our attitudes towards violence. So most civilized nations, obviously the United States is the great exception, don't kill prisoners anymore. They don't kill convicts, criminals. Also, the kinds of executions that are carried out don't revel in the violence of it all. And again, maybe the exception to that would be the executions of Saddam Hussein and some other officials in Iraq.
But here they're not spectacles.
No, so we're not
done quietly by injection usually. And
that's right. So we're not saying that this is something that we're proud of. In fact, we're sort of, at least civilized people are ashamed of these sorts of acts. But what's even more dramatic that Pinker points out in this piece is that, especially over the last 50 years, there has been a huge decrease in the number of wars, civil wars, especially wars between nations. We're down to terrorism, to the kind of war that we're seeing in Darfur that's really sort of banditry or anarchy rather than conventional warfare.
So are you saying that this is evidence that it's not that deeply rooted that we're able to transcend?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying.
But that still doesn't mean that it's not there. I mean. Well,
the thing is, Pinker and there's another anthropologist at Harvard named Richard Wrangham who wrote this book that came out, I guess, about 10 years ago, but it's still very influential, called Demonic Males.
Yeah.
Do you remember that book? And he traces human violence and warfare all the way back to chimpanzees, because chimpanzees sometimes, male chimpanzees in one troop will go and attack and even kill chimpanzees in another troop. And Wrangham says this shows that human warfare is this very deep-rooted instinct. He doesn't say absolutely that it's inevitable, but that's the very strong implication of the way that he analyzes it. And I think that the statistics that Pinker presents in this recent essay show that warfare can be understood as a cultural phenomenon, at least as much as a biological phenomenon.
Yeah.
And I guess what makes me mad is the suggestion of some of the Darwinians that if it's really deeply rooted in our genes and in evolution, that somehow it's going to be difficult or impossible to eradicate.
But they're not saying we shouldn't try, and and Pinker's apparently saying that we've made progress overcoming that. I mean, just because something's biological, it doesn't mean that now we have this. Now that we have this overlayer of this great information processor in our heads, we can recognize these things. In fact, discover that the violent tendencies are deeply rooted, and then do something to try to counteract that, or at least take it into account. But
that's right. It just seems to me that there's this contradiction between that message, and I think Pinker is saying that in this recent piece, as any responsible intellectual would. But I think there's a contradiction between that hopeful, constructive message that we can control warfare and possibly even eradicate it with certain measures. There's a contradiction between that and this very sort of dark, fatalistic Darwinian view that he likes to beat us over the head with in certain of his writings. I'm sorry, that's like this rant that I've fallen into.
I know it's something you've written about a lot, and well, to get back to Virginia Tech, I mean, I get, I don't think anyone's saying that, using that to argue that it's inevitable that we're going to have these mass murders like this, and that obviously in this case it was, maybe you could have a deep-rooted instinct for violence that most of us are able to suppress because of acculturation or just the way our brains work, and then someone else could end up being boxed into this situation where a combination of his environment and how he came out in the genetic lottery and how his brain was evolved.
Yeah, well,
it just all led to this flashpoint. But what can you really say beyond that from a scientific perspective?
Well, there is this long history of scientific attempts to understand extreme violence and criminal behavior. I was just looking this morning at a book. I don't know if you've read it. I'm sure you've heard of it, The Mismeasure of Man by
Gould's book,
the late Stephen Jay Gould. This is apparently one of Bob Wright's favorite scientists. I'm sure Bob was really sorry when Steve Gould passed away. But in this book, Gould talks about the history of racial theories of behavior and intelligence and so forth.
Yeah.
And he's got this fascinating section about an Italian scientist named Cesare Lombroso, who in the late 19th century had this theory of criminal behavior in which he said he could predict who was going to be a criminal by looking at their physiology. And of course...
was it related to phrenology and
yes.
reading the bumps on your skull?
And of course it was the... he said that people with certain what he called primitive characteristics, which meant non-Caucasian, were much more likely to be criminals
obviously he was wrong.
than not. But this was...
When you look at who most of the mass murderers of the century, Caucasian males come out pretty well, right?
That's right. Thank you.
Yeah.
But I think, this was just...
this is old stuff. I think the sociobiologists have gone way beyond that.
They've gotten much more sophisticated than that. Let me just mention a couple of other...
More subtle, too.
Well, so now we've got the possibility of specific genes that are associated with criminal behavior. So, for example, here's a cover of a magazine called, I don't know if I'm holding that up correctly, called Prospect, a British monthly. The only reason I saw this is because I had a review of a book about superstring theory that came out in the same issue last summer. But the cover story talks about what it claims are successful recent attempts to find biological correlates, or especially genetic correlates of extreme violent criminal behavior. And supposedly a group in England has found a gene that leads to, I think it's deficits of serotonin that make you more likely to be a sociopath.
Yeah, well, that seems... reduced serotonin definitely is, related to depression and other anxiety and things like this. So you can certainly see that if someone had a genetic predisposition to produce less serotonin, they might be somewhat more likely, combined with all these other factors, biological and environmental, to snap.
Well, actually, apparently this group has said that this gene in combination with childhood abuse leads to a very high probability of criminal behavior.
Yeah.
George, all I can say is that based on the history of this field, the whole attempt to find biological correlates of criminality, I'll bet you anything that this turns out to be bullshit.
Yeah.
And the whole idea that serotonin levels can explain...
but they're not saying that they can explain them. They're saying that it's one factor, and why doesn't it? It helps to know that. Maybe it's wrong, but there'll be other experiments that will check that out. Certainly there's a biological basis to violence. It's just the question is how, to what degree that can be overcome by thinking in our brains,
right.
and to what extent culture culture is involved. I mean, culture basically comes out of our, biological substrate as well. It's just an overlay, but, it all comes down to biology at some point. But I think you can believe that without taking it to these ridiculously reductionist extremes that Gould writes about in his book.
Let me just give you another example. It's still going back a ways. This goes back to the 70s. Here's a book called Violence in the Brain. It was written by two Harvard psychiatrists, and I think it came out around 1970.
Yeah.
And Vernon Mark and Frank Irvin. And they were doing experiments on psychosurgery, lobotomies, as well as brain implants, electrodes that are stuck in certain parts of the brain and can control emotions and even behavior. And this book was written right around the time that there were these race riots in America. There were also student riots, but they focused especially on the race riots. And in the book, they proposed that some of the most violent participants in these riots might have been suffering from brain lesions, brain damage of some kind, and that the solution would be to cut into their brains, carry out psychosurgery, or stick electrodes in their brains that would quell their violent impulses. Professors at Harvard.
That's obviously pretty nutty. I mean, it puts too much faith in what we know about neuroscience, which is really so very little. So, I can see why that would get you angry. But
by the way, there's one.
People aren't saying that now.
Well, but I think that we're going to.
Well, let's tie it back to Virginia Tech, since that's what we were going to start out with. I mean, if it's not biological or cultural combined with biological, do you think there's pure evil loose?
No, I think it is biological. I think there is such a thing as a biological sociopath, or just a sociopath, whether it's cultural or environmental or...
Yeah, I just don't think that distinction really gets you anywhere.
Yeah, I guess, again, what I'm arguing for is these simple models, the idea that we can find some kind of magic marker for that will help us predict who these people are going to be. I mean, in this case... I
just don't think anyone's really saying that. I think they're saying that you can find lots of different markers, and it's and just trying to understand some very, very disturbing phenomenon.
One thing I heard on CNN recently, after the Virginia Tech shooting, that I'd never heard before, I'm not even sure if it's true or not, was that Charles Whitman,
the one at University of Texas, Austin?
Yes.
The one that the Eagle Scout that climbed up in the top tower.
It was, mid-60s.
You were an Eagle Scout, weren't you?
No, I wasn't. No, I have an aversion to uniforms and regimentation.
I didn't quite make Eagle, but I was close.
Oh, good for you. That's hard to imagine, actually. But anyway, back to Charles Whitman.
Well, the reason I couldn't get it is you had to get something called the God and Country Award.
You're the wrong person.
Yeah, already then. Anyway, to get back to Whitman.
Yeah, so according to this CNN report, there was an autopsy conducted on him after he was shot to death by the police that found a tumor in his frontal lobes. Mm-hmm. And there has been evidence that there have been, I think CNN actually referred to a study of death row inmates been convicted of violent crimes, and the sorts of really senseless crimes where somebody goes into a convenience store, gets the money, but then shoots the clerk anyway before they leave. That an unusually high proportion of these people have some sort of brain lesion or tumor or some brain abnormality. Yeah. Now the problem with these sorts of things, and I think that could be a genuine correlation that would hold up.
Yeah, so there's something that's biological but not necessarily deeply rooted. I see what you mean. It's an aberration.
But then the question is what you do with that kind of information.
Yeah.
It would probably mean that your chances, if you have this sort of lesion, your chances of becoming a violent criminal or committing some kind of horrible act in a state of rage would be, let's say, 50% higher than they would be normally, which might mean that you still would have like a 1 in 500 chance of committing such an act, and there would be all sorts of other people, the vast majority of people with these same biological markers would never commit such a crime.
Yeah.
So the question is what you do with this kind of information.
Yeah.
It's very problematic. Just one more story. I'll stop ranting about this. In the 1960s, the big biological marker that people got all excited about was an extra Y chromosome for males. Do you remember that? Some men, we're only supposed to have one Y chromosome. There is this occasional mutation. Baby boys are sometimes born with 2 Y chromosomes. It's associated with mild retardation. But it's really not a very dramatic effect. But there was there were a couple of studies that came out in the 60s that suggested, I guess someone found more of these double Y men in prison than you'd expect. And so the claim was that, a double Y man is like this lethal super male drenched in testosterone, and he's going to go out and rape
marginally more likely to.
It's not true. It turned out follow-up studies have shown that there's no correlation between the double Y syndrome and violence. So
it's tumors.
Tumors, okay.
So, are they going to do an autopsy on the Virginia Tech shooter, do you think?
Well, it would be, and by the way, I should say, I certainly think science should address this problem. I just don't want it to
Why does it bother you so much that when they do and they come up with results?
Well, it's because the way the results are discussed and so often sensationalized, by these, like I said, Mark and Irvin, these guys at Harvard University, for Christ's sake.
Well, but it was one idea, and it got kind of washed out in the general marketplace of ideas, and no one's even heard of them now.
Yeah, well, I've done my best to publicize them. I actually wrote.
I'm sure.
I actually wrote an article.
Well, did you on Virginia Tech? There was an op-ed piece in the New York Times by a woman who's she's actually an engineering professor, and she was writing about being, I guess, semi-stalked by a student, and he had apparently set up camp and was living in a room across from her office just so he could watch after her. In a very protective manner, of course, and just engaging in this very creepy, scary behavior. And again, she complained to people at the school, and they said, well, there's really nothing we can do. Students do have rights. But the reason I thought about that is she's apparently written a book that's coming out this fall, I think, called, is it Evil Genes or something like that?
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, and I wasn't able to find enough information to see if she's arguing some of these things that you just got done mentioning. But it was kind of funny looking at her website, because everything else she's written just about has to do with, I think it was electrical engineering and acoustical signaling, and now she's writing a book about evil genes. But I don't know.
All the danger signs are there.
It was a really good op-ed piece.
It was. I read. Well, the thing that stuck in my mind was that the student put a live cockroach on her door with Scotch tape.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
As a kind of present, I think.
Yeah, that's a little twisted.
That would scare me.
Yeah.
That's somebody who obviously is disturbed. There's another piece. We were talking about Pinker's essay, History of Violence, on Brockman's website. There is Brockman has posted a couple of pieces by a psychologist named Philip Zimbardo on the website. I don't know if you've seen those. So he's the guy who carried out this famous experiment at Stanford in, I think it was the 1970s, called the Stanford Prison Experiment.
Yeah.
And what he did was he separated students into, he created this kind of mock prison. So he separated students into prisoners and guards, and I think they wore different colored uniforms to distinguish them.
Yeah.
And remarkably quickly, the guards became sadistic toward these other students who were their friends. In fact, it got out of control so rapidly, and some of what was supposed to be sort of fake threats actually led to acts of violence that Zimbardo had to cut the experiment short. Mm-hmm. And the way he's interpreted this, and he has a new book out. It's called, I think, The Lucifer Effect. And his the big theme that he draws out of all his research, which he's carried out for decades, is that evil is often situational. So he says it's not useful. Maybe there are some people who are biological sociopaths, but when you try to understand Nazi Germany or Abu Ghraib, the torture in the Iraqi prison, or some of the atrocities that are routinely committed in war, or even acts of violence.
That it's situational, that you get people in the room and they're kind of, you get all these positive feedback effects where one person does something that another person maybe imitates, and then you imitate the imitator, and and it just, spirals out of control. But
so it's much more of a classic,
more of an environmental explanation.
And that's not necessarily reassuring.
Yeah, no, it's not reassuring at all, because, it's environmental, but again, your environment includes other people, and people are behaving in a means that, or for reasons that are both rooted in evolution and have to do with how fast the fluorescent lights are flickering or something. It's just this huge Gordian knot of, what's environmental and what's biological, and it's something you can talk about forever, but it just doesn't really lead to anything.
Well, what Zimbardo's the environmental models suggest that almost anybody, given the right or wrong circumstances, might commit horrible, violent, sadistic acts. This was that was the theme of that famous Milgram experiment at Yale.
Right, I was just thinking Stanley Milgram. Right, and he, basically people could be trained to give electrical shocks to other people.
Right, that was invoked to explain Nazis and so forth. The positive message that comes out of that is that, and I think this is a counter to some of the Darwinian fatalism of Pinker and Wrangham and some others. The positive message is that if we create the right environment, then we can really reduce these acts.
But, again, if you have a frontal lobe brain tumor and you're put into one of these environments, you'll probably be considerably more likely to react violently than someone who doesn't.
Well, then, let's make sure that you can't get a gun that can blow away 30 people in 20 minutes.
We don't have an argument there, but I doubt that Pinker would argue with that.
No, he probably. Well, I
don't either.
No, I'm going back to Mickey Kaus and his suggestion that we need more guns. By the way, I was looking at the comments section on Mickey and Bob's chat, and somebody mentioned a post on or a blogger named Elaine Boozler, who on Huffington Post has a wonderful rant about, it's definitely a rant, but some rants are good, about the need for gun control. She points out, for example, that last year there were 25 children under the age of 17 in the United States who were killed by guns. That's more than the number of children killed by guns in all the other industrial nations combined.
Right.
We shouldn't be arguing about this anymore.
Yeah, I know. Well, maybe there's a biological, evolutionary psychology reason for these people having this dedication to this deep, almost mystical, religious devotion to guns and the right to bear arms.
Yeah.
I saw a bumper sticker when I was in Santa Barbara when I was doing my science writer in residence thing at the Kavli Institute, and it said, if Vince Foster had a gun, maybe he'd still be alive. And I realized, wow, this may be Santa Barbara, but I'm in Southern California.
Wait a minute. You mean,
but
that's assuming
let's talk about science.
Okay.
I mean, I think there's a lot of people talking about gun control.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, back to science. Well, how about, one more science-related item, one more item on...
let's keep on, the nature-nurture seems to kind of be the emergent theme this morning, so...
Yeah. Well, I've got, before I know I want to talk about that article in the New Yorker on language, but before that, just one more violence-related item. So I had an article that came out in the New Yorker in the fall of 2005 on a guy named Jose Delgado, who was a neuroscientist at Yale, the same era of Irvin and Frank, when they were doing experiments with implants and so forth. Mm-hmm. And he toyed with the idea. He actually wrote a book called Toward a Psycho-Civilized Society, in which he suggested that maybe brain implants could make us... He was a pacifist. He said he doesn't want people to commit violent acts. Yeah. And he said maybe we can have brain implants to calm us down when we're getting really mad at each other. And he carried out this crazy experiment. He stuck electrodes in the brain of a bull, and he went to a bull ring in Spain, and the bull charged him, and he's sitting there holding a little remote control transmitter, and he's pushing buttons furiously, and he sends a signal, and it stimulates part of the brain that supposedly controlled aggression, and just before the bull got to him, it stopped dead in its tracks, and then it trotted away peacefully. Mm-hmm. And this made the front page of the New York Times, and people got all excited because...
that is pretty cool.
It is pretty cool. They thought, maybe this is the solution. We'll stick electrodes in our brains and control our violence that way. Except the only question is, who gets the electrodes in the brain and who gets to hold the remote controller?
Wow, that's the perfect metaphor for the whole dilemma, right?
Yeah.
Well, so what? You think science has nothing to say about violent instincts or where war comes from, and that we should
I think it has
stay away from it because it's too dangerous?
No.
It might get in the hands of someone that wants to hold the remote control and zap us like the people in the Stanley Milgram experiment.
Well, I'm all for...
I'm not sure what you're angry about.
Yeah, I'm all for... I'm angry about reductionistic and fatalistic and deterministic explanations of violence from...
I just don't think there's a... maybe one study's determined is ridiculously reductionist, but it's just one piece of the puzzle, and then people are, putting together this bigger picture, or at least trying.
Yeah. Well...
I don't know why I'm so optimistic and sunny.
Well, you are. Well, I think, you hope that scientists are more rational than I do, I guess. But I'm...
Well, I also don't think they have a whole lot of power to, hold the remote controls or decide which government officials get to have them. It's all just part of the great ferment of ideas, John. Some of them are going to be kind of nutty, or they'll seem nutty later, and but
something? Robert McNamara in Fog of War. I forget if I mentioned this in a previous blog. He's got this amazing comment in there where he says, I'm not so naive to think we can ever eradicate war. We're not going to change human nature soon.
Yeah.
So I think that the way that science depicts these issues, the way that it describes our behavior, does or can have political effects. I really think it can.
Yeah, but, if they're reporting, if it's science, then, it's presumably supposed to be sort of true, right?
Oh, God. You of all people saying that.
No, but, again, it's the marketplace of ideas. There's people who have, who come down more on the nature side. Other people come down more on the nurture side. So,
that's true.
Why just pick, these one little piece, and then get so upset about it.
It's just that I worry that Darwinians and the fatalists and the determinists are ascendant now. That's what worries me. So as long as I can sit here and mouth off on blogging heads, then I guess maybe it'll work out. Yeah.
I think it's going to be okay, John.
Okay, thanks, George.
I really do want to talk about this tribe in the Amazon that was in that New Yorker piece.
Yeah, so give people some background on that.
Yeah,
I thought that was fascinating too.
Yeah, and again we're back to the old nature nurture nut here, where Chomsky, Noam Chomsky, the great linguist and also left-wing political radical, who has, I think it's fair to say, he has kind of a cult-like following, especially on his politics and his political books, and this kind of spills over, some people would say, to his linguistic theory. But
I just have to interject. I think he would call himself an anarchist rather than
an anarchist,
a left-winger. He hates all forms of government, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, that sounds, okay. But anyway, we're talking about Chomsky, the linguist,
yes.
and he really, did the research that's just been kind of the Bible of linguistics for, much of the latter part of the 20th century. As I understand, he did this as a reaction to the old behaviorism, and B.F. Skinner, who was saying that the only thing psychology can really address is behavior and stimulus and response, and you can't get inside the black box and really study the mind, and in the more radical formulations of that, saying the mind really doesn't exist. It's just kind of this construct, and there isn't really this deep cognitive behavior, but just this complex web of stimuli and responses. And then it was really kind of in reaction to that whole atmosphere, which just amazingly dominated psychology for decades, that Chomsky came up with this idea of language being this innate faculty that, sometimes as he describes it, it's almost like another physical organ. Not quite like a kidney or a gallbladder in your head, but a certain specific region. But all these pieces taken together give you this kind of deep structure that results in language.
Yeah. Wow, that was a wonderful. I've written about Chomsky, and trying to explain his work often ties me up in knots. And
I don't know if that was right what I said.
No. Well, basically, we mentioned Pinker. Pinker has this book, The Language Instinct.
He's a big Chomskyan, right?
Yes, and that's what Chomsky basically was arguing, that language isn't something that we acquire solely through trial and error and experience.
Yeah.
It's actually an instinct to a great degree.
Right.
It is innate.
And that sounds, when you imagine, just through, like a child learning to speak, obviously it's listening to its parents speak, it's getting a certain amount of coaching, but there's just no way that by trial and error you can come up with this complex language structure. So it's always seemed really plausible to me that there was some kind of internal, deep wiring that allows that to happen. So it's like elicited by the training and experience, but that that it's very deeply ingrained.
Yes. Now the weird thing about Chomsky, though, so I interviewed him. I did a profile of him for Scientific American about, it must have been 15 years ago, and I interviewed him a couple of times after that for The End of Science and The Undiscovered Mind, my second book, and I also talked to a bunch of other linguists and cognitive scientists, including Pinker, about Chomsky, and he's first of all, he's definitely one of the 3 or 4 smartest people I've ever met. He is just dazzlingly brilliant and erudite, and you can he's almost like a computer. You plug a question into him, and this perfectly formed, brilliantly thought through answer comes out in complete sentences and paragraphs.
I've had that experience too, interviewing him.
There's almost this kind of robotic quality to him. Robotic doesn't quite get at it, but he's almost so smart that he's kind of eerie. But there's also this sort of a cult-like aspect to the way that he's dominated linguistics over the last half century. He really sort of, I think, bullies people into submission without even necessarily doing it himself. People are just awestruck by his reputation.
Oh, he's very intimidating, and but I mean that as a compliment. I mean, he's just, as you say, he's just so articulate. And when I interviewed him, it was for a piece I did for Science Times on chimp language, and there'd been some new recent study by this woman Sue Rumbaugh down in
at Columbia.
Is it Georgia Tech?
Oh, Georgia. Okay.
Yeah, somewhere in the South. I think it's Georgia Tech, and she does the work with the bonobo chimps, and and then trying to make the case that they do have a rudimentary language, and of course that's anathema to the Chomskyans, who would say that, well, it's one thing to be able to identify. You can even have a vocabulary or a visual vocabulary with a chimpanzee or a bonobo, but unless they actually have the ability to form syntax and what you call recursion, where you can make arbitrarily complex sentences, like the man who was sitting in the chair that was made in Japan by a peasant who wove it from rice fibers that he had grown, stood up and talked to the woman who, you can just go on and on and on ad infinitum, embed one structure into another, and that this is really the essence of language, and it's something that people do, and that no other creature seems to be able to do it in any way. And this was supposed to be, I guess in the latest formulation of Chomsky's theories, this was the single most important part of the deep structure.
That's the
what's
key.
Innate, was this ability to do this recursive kind of processing. And that's what was interesting about this piece in the New Yorker, where there was these linguists who've been studying this primitive tribe somewhere in South America in the headwaters of the Amazon, and they find evidence that they don't think recursively or speak recursively, and they have this language that just is like, landed here from the planet Xenon or something.
Right. Yeah, there's no recursion. I think they don't have any concept of number beyond 2, I think it was.
Yeah, 1, 2, and many.
1, 2, and many.
I've heard that about other tribes as well.
Yeah, I guess recursion is the really stunning finding, but it also seemed that they don't have any concept of time. So it sounds, in a way, it made me suspicious because it sounded like the old sort of hippie ideal of the noble savage living, being here now and living totally in the present, and
they didn't really seem so noble, though.
Yeah, right.
Savage, definitely, but I mean, it's always dangerous to say that or imply, that you believe that one tribe or culture is primitive compared to another. But my God, if that's not a primitive tribe, I don't know what is.
Yeah. Well, so I guess, one of the problems that I had first of all, I thought, here's the first page of the article. That's a picture of the anthropologist. His name is Dan Everett, and in this river down where this tribe lives. This was in the April 16th issue, by the way. And one of the problems I had with this is that apparently this language is maybe the hardest language that linguists have ever encountered. And the first people who really tried to understand it were missionaries. And in fact, Dan Everett, this linguist, initially went down there as a Christian missionary. And then
amazing? And then he came back and became a doctor of linguistics.
And he fell away from his faith.
Yeah.
And it's so difficult that it's very hard it's so difficult to learn this language. It's so peculiar, so hard to understand in terms, by comparing it to other languages, that it seems as though everybody is really reliant on this guy Everett to be interpreting his results in a straightforward way.
You'd need 2 or 3 people who are as adept in this language as he is, I think, to really really know what's going on, because otherwise it's just based on one person's data, and he may be, maybe he's misreading it. I mean, how, it'd be nice to have a counterbalance.
Yeah, but I mean, it is fascinating. It sounds like it is within linguistic circles, it's really causing big problems for the Chomsky, and some of them are trying to dismiss it, but others are taking it very seriously. I think there's at least one guy who's gone down there with Everett and tried to do some data collection on his own, but they describe the way you try to get data from these people, and they don't even sort of get or just don't care about the whole process of, these are the scientists, you are the people being studied, you have to cooperate in these certain ways to help them.
Except they really liked, in the I think it was the last scene of the article, they're all gathered in the HUD and watching a film of one of the remakes of King Kong, not the one with Jessica Lange, but the one after that. And they're really getting into this film, and yet the linguist in the article is still basically arguing that they're not thinking abstractly. I mean, that was another thing. They don't have the ability to think abstractly, supposedly. They don't do this recursive thing with language. They don't have a language that has anything like a Chomskyan deep structure. And I don't know. It's hard not to be dubious, because at the same time, he's giving examples of, they'll say things like, leopard go in woods or monkey in tree, and there you've got a subject, you've got a verb, you've got an object, and it seems to me like
what does it even mean to say?
One of my favorite things that Chomsky said to really get across is what he meant by this idea that there was this deep structure that gives rise to language, so that all languages are similar, and it's something so deep and abstract that it doesn't matter that, like in French or Spanish, you might put the adjective on the other side of the noun as you would in English, or in German you can put the verb at the end of the sentence and then pile up all of this stuff at the beginning. But still, at a deeper level or higher level of abstraction, kind of a contradictory image there, they're the same basic language, or the same way of thought. And the way he got this across was saying that if a Martian came to Earth, it would think that we were all speaking the same language.
Yeah, it's interesting. And this, right at the actually after that great scene with these people watching King Kong, suddenly this journalist introduces Everett's wife into the article.
Oh yeah, she had been a missionary with them, right?
Yes,
and then they had split up.
And she still is a Christian and missionary, and it was really fascinating because the whole article had sort of created this dichotomy between this Chomskyan view of language with recursion, and then Everett's model, and he's trying to say that there could be. Actually, I guess his argument really is that maybe language is more contingent and is created more by trial and error and experience than Chomsky has suggested. But he's got his sort of
more situational.
Yes.
Like that Stanford experiment you were describing with the violence.
Yes, exactly.
It depends on who's in the room and how people are sort of reacting to each other and feeding off each other.
But he's still trying to understand it in terms of sort of these conventional linguistic structures. And then the wife comes along, his former wife, who I guess is a very good linguist. She's not a professional linguist. She's still a missionary. That's her main, that's her profession. But she's dedicated her life to understanding these people as well. And she said that the way to understand them is as singers.
Singers, yeah.
So she says.
Yeah, there's that beautiful scene where she's describing, or I guess he's describing. Is it the writer who's listen? Here's this beautiful singing, and he goes and sees it's one of the tribal women sitting there. Spinning cloth or weaving or something.
Yes.
And she's singing, and her little girl is there kind of looking at her, and that the language was more like this song, and they instill it by singing to their children.
It was beautiful. I mean, this article
Just kind of stepping out of the whole box of, is it Chomskyan or is it more behavioristic, and just kind of looking at it in a different way, maybe.
Yeah.
But you know what just occurred to me? These people were they like evangelical Christians or fundamentalists? But you know, one of the big parts of the whole fundamentalist myth is this idea of the Tower of Babel, and that the way language came to earth was we all spoke a single language. Something was called Nostratic, I guess, and then God is punishment for our pride, fractured all of our languages into all these different. I know people were building the Tower of Babel, and for some reason the Tower of Babel was this huge affront to God. So to keep them from finishing the tower and punishing them, he split up their language so they couldn't understand each other. So if you were really instilled in this fundamentalist Christian stuff, and then you became a linguist, I wonder if you'd have kind of a deep down suspicion that languages really aren't related in the Chomskyan sense.
That's great.
Yeah.
I'm surprised the guy who wrote this article didn't think of that. That's a great riff on this whole debate that this tribe is creating.
Just struck me for some reason. I was thinking about Babel, I guess.
You know, just another interesting feature of Chomsky, who, by the way, has been very dismissive, and I think this is typical of him, has been very dismissive of the work that's building on this tribe.
Yeah, I mean, it's just one tribe.
Well, yeah, sure, and that's fair enough. But what's peculiar about Chomsky is that he was one of the first modern scientists to understand this really fundamental aspect of being human, or language capacity, in evolutionary terms, or at least in biological terms. And he sort of showed that it's innate, it's this instinct, it's not something you can understand as, building on the blank slate. It's not all trial and error and experience. But the peculiar thing about Chomsky is that he's always been either cool or downright hostile to sociobiologists, evolutionary psychologists, Pinker, E.O. Wilson, and others who have tried to understand all human behavior and psychology in evolutionary terms. In fact, Chomsky has even said that he doesn't like to speculate about
whether it's evolutionary.
Yeah, whether even language. He doesn't even like to.
That's something I've never understood, because he's saying that it's innate.
Yes.
As opposed, so it's directly opposite of the argument of the behaviorists. It's saying everything's learned and environmental. So he's saying it's innate. He's saying it's it's this thing called deep structure, that it's built into the brain, which to me says it's biological. It's electrochemical wiring. So, how can he then say that he's not necessarily, or at least he's not willing to speculate about it emerging through evolution?
I think.
Where else would it come from?
Well, Pinker has suggested. I've talked to Pinker about this, and he's suggested that Chomsky's politics are affecting his science here. So, biological, genetic, evolutionary explanations of human behavior have historically been more associated with conservative right-wing political views, going back to the Nazis and eugenics, or even social Darwinists at the end of the
so is it related, like the Lysenko and the whole, like you have to believe in the perfectibility of man to be a good communist, and an environment has to trump. Nurture has to trump nature.
Something like that. I think. So I've asked Chomsky about this, and he insists that he just thinks that evolutionary psychology is flimsy. It's just insubstantial science, and until they have something really rigorous and solid to say about certain kinds of behaviors or about the origins of language, he's just not really interested in it.
Yeah.
But it is.
That seems fair enough.
Yeah. But it is another peculiarity in his thinking. I remember this exchange I had with Chomsky, so I had been talking to him, asking him about his political views, and that's when he told me that, if anything, he's really an anarchist, and he hated the Soviet Union, totalitarian leftist regimes, just as much as he hates our government, for example. And then so I'm sort of saying, well, how would you characterize your politics? And he finally said, well, I'm anti-authoritarian. Whatever the authority is, I'm against it. So I said, oh, isn't that interesting? Because in linguistics, you are the authority. And he glared at me. His eyes popped out. Normally, you remember, he's such a cool, calm person. But he got pissed off, and he immediately said, I'm not the authority. Whoever said that I'm the authority in linguistics? And he goes on this rant about how, he doesn't even understand any languages well except for English, and the only reason he got tenure at MIT is because they don't really care about the humanities there. And it was absurd because, of course, he's dominated linguistics probably more than any scientist has dominated any other field. But
he started out as the maverick, though.
Yes.
So he was really he was really the David going after the Goliath of behaviorism, and that's probably more consistent with how he sees it himself. It's just that he succeeded. And,
that's
interesting.
It just goes back to this, what I was saying early about my sense that there's something weird going on with Chomsky that makes it very. I can't really interpret anything he says in absolutely straightforward terms. There's always something going on in his head that's a little more complicated.
Yeah. I feel like I always feel there's just something really big I'm missing, and then every once in a while I try to read more, but then I still don't get it.
Oh God, linguistics is. I remember in college I thought linguistics. That seems like an interesting field. I'm sort of an English major type person, but this is kind of quasi-scientific, and so I started taking a course in linguistics and reading up a little bit on it, and oh my God, it's just hideously complicated.
Yeah, for a while I had a little kind of mini linguistics beat at the Times, and I wrote, a piece on nostratic, this idea that all of our languages come from this one mother language, and then there was this, and then another one. I guess that's when I did this chimp language thing. One thing I dealt with a lot of particle physicists, and there's some nice particle physicists, but there's also some pretty intense ones, and they have these rather, really bitter, nasty rivalries, but it was just nothing compared to linguistics.
Yeah, right.
Oh.
Yes, well, the less data a field has, the less hard data, I guess, the more bitter the fights are.
Yes, that's true.
Hey,
well, I don't know, should we wrap it up?
Yeah, I just realized we're over an hour.
Yeah, that was very absorbing.
Time flies.
Hey, I wanted to mention, earlier on, when we first started, there were these bells ringing outside my window, and I don't know if anyone can hear them on the tape, but I was wondering what it was, and so I just thought I should mention that I live next to this church, Cristo Rey Catholic Church, and they have these beautiful brass bells, and they started ringing this morning, and I couldn't figure out what it was, because I looked out my window, and there's not any kind of procession going on, and Holy Week's over, and then I just got an email informing me that all the churches in the nation today were asked at this time to ring their bells in solidarity for the slain students at Virginia Tech.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
I wonder if I haven't heard anything here. We've got a church just down the street from me, but so I wonder if they rang the bells today.
I wonder. Yeah, this was Catholic, Presbyterian, all over town, and I guess all over the country. And
well, that's a good way to end.
Yeah.
Come back.
Okay, well, good talking to you, John.
Yeah, same here. Maybe talk to you next week.
Look for you next week.
Bye.